Right, thank you to you all. I just want to briefly introduce Anthony. I'm going to let him do a full introduction. I've actually heard Anthony talk on the subject of the 5 forces of change on a number of occasions when he's presented to our alumni at regional events. I've always found his insight into change to be very thought-provoking and practical. So now I would like to hand you over to Anthony, who will introduce himself. Anthony, it's over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. That's if you're on the same time zone as me, where it's evening. My name's Anthony Greenfield, and I'm going to be talking about achieving successful change, the 5 forces of change. I've worked for over 20 years with all kinds of organizations going through transformational change, from Marks and Spencer's through to Prudential. Currently, I'm working on a major transformation with the Royal Mail in the UK, which is probably one of the biggest transformation projects, certainly in the UK at this time. But I will sort of introduce myself a little as we go along. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off really by asking a question, putting a question to you. And the question is this: how does change affect motivation at work? This is a question that I asked myself a number of years ago. I've worked with all kinds of organizations, all trying to improve performance, all struggling with the human side of change. So what I'd like to share with you today is something quite important, which is firstly the answer to this particular question, but really what emerged from it, which is a practical framework for bringing about successful change. And that framework is the 5 forces of change. So what does happen to motivation? Well, when change comes along, people's key motivators are threatened or undermined. The things that make them go the extra mile and excel at work. There's no wonder then that they actively oppose, or they might just avoid the change and hope that it'll go away. And there are 3 actors really involved when it comes to change. First off, you have organizations, and organizations are facing all kinds of competition, globalization, new technology, the internet, and so forth. They have little choice but to change, or they risk, they risk perhaps failing altogether. So organizations have got to keep pace with the change in the world. But the interesting thing is that people do have a choice as well. It may not always be obvious. People think, oh, well, when I tell some organizations that, people have a choice, they say, well, we're not giving our people a choice. The change is going to happen, and there's no choice about it. But if you take an example of a bank that I work with, it was the result of a merger between 2 separate banks. And when people introduced themselves to you, years after the merger, they still refer to themselves as being part of one bank or the other bank. And one of the senior managers said to me, mentally, we remain 2 separate organizations. So this big change and all the benefits that they'd hoped for, a lot of it had gone to waste because the people themselves had chosen not to change. And if people don't change, there is no change. So it's the role of the leader to create an environment in which people are willing and able to make that choice to change. And people can make a positive choice to pursue change, to get behind change and take ownership for change, if the leadership is right, if people are truly engaged in that change. And that's really fundamentally what I'm talking about this evening. Let's take another look at change and people. Imagine an individual going through a change. Well, there are two sort of responses that people tend to come out with. One is a sort of more rational response, and one tends to be, if you like, a more emotional response. So let's take a simple example. Imagine that your organization, or organization you know, is moving location. It's moving from an old office to a brand new office with, all mod comms and good communications and so forth. So the rational response is simply, well, the new location's got much better facilities, let's move. But the emotional response, which I've seen happen, where an organization has moved from a sort of a dark, dingy offices that they'd been in for decades into bright, shiny new steel and glass building, people were saying, well, our place has character, we're used to it. Why move? So emotionally, there's a lot of suspicion about that change, even though logically it would seem that it would be the only sensible thing to do. Let's take a different type of a change. Let's imagine that something like this, that head office has made some recommendations to save time and money. The logic would say, well, let's implement them. We're going to save time, we're going to save money. But the emotional response might be something like, well, what do they know about how we operate on the ground? Do they think we're incompetent? Do they think we've been wasting time and money all of this up until now? The issue comes when organizations try to approach change along purely rational lines. So they follow the logic, they build the business case, they explain the benefits, and then they wonder why the change never happened. And that's because of the emotional response that I'll talk about in just a moment. So I'd like to answer the question, why do people struggle with change? And then, more importantly, how can you work with the grain of human nature to minimize the disruption caused by change and maximize the return on investment, because all sorts of investment of time, energy, emotion goes into making change happen. And then too often afterwards, people aren't seeing that return. So, I assume because you are on this webinar that you are interested in change, and you are perhaps in the midst of change in your own organization, or that you've experienced change previously. So as we go through the rest of the slides and the presentation today, I'd like you to perhaps pick on a particular change that you're involved in or have been involved in. And my suggestion would be one, it needs to be a complex change, not just something very simple, but it needs to be something that's fairly disruptive and that affects people. If you just bear that in mind. So, after a number of years of research, which culminated in the book, The 5 Forces of Change, identified 5 key motivators that are threatened by change. And these are certainty, purpose, control, connection, success. And they are the 5 forces of change. Certainty is our need for stability and predictability, but when change comes along, there's a great deal of uncertainty. Purpose is our need for a sense of purpose, but when change comes along, we sometimes lose direction. Control is our need for control over the things that affect us. But when change comes along, we can feel like helpless victims rather than feeling in control of things. The 4th of the 5 forces of change is connection. A need to stay connected to people, habits, ideas, and things. This is emotional attachment to things. When change comes along, there's a sense of loss. And finally, success is our need for achievement. But when change comes along, there's often fear that failure is going to happen. And sometimes there is actual failure as we try to get to grips with new ways of doing things. So I'd like to take you on a tour of these 5 forces of change so that you can understand a bit more fundamentally why people oppose change or avoid change, and then what you can do about it. Let's begin with certainty then, our need for predictability and stability. Some of you may recognize the picture here. In fact, what you have here is a photograph of the volcano that erupted in Iceland in April 2010. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was hugely disruptive, particularly to people who wanted to fly abroad. One minute the airports were open and you could fly, the next minute you couldn't. And at that precise time, I was waiting to start a program of leadership development in the US. And people were flying in from all around the world. And one day it looked like everything was okay, and then by the evening all the airports were shut again. And there was a great deal of uncertainty. And this was a very important thing for me. And when you combine importance with uncertainty, what you get in reaction to that is stress. Something is important to you, becomes very uncertain, it is very stressful. And in times of change, things that are important to you, like your job role, for example, suddenly become very uncertain, and sometimes that uncertainty stretches on for long periods of time, causing stress and anxiety, and giving people a perfectly good reason for wanting to oppose or avoid the change. That's what sits behind certainty, at least in a nutshell. So, the question is, as leaders, as anybody who might be leading a change, and I don't just mean directors of organizations, I mean anybody involved in some kind of leadership role, how can you create certainty in times of uncertainty? In other words, during times of change. And if you look at these photos, hopefully you will recognize at least some of them. These are leaders, and they are leaders who have led in times of turmoil and change. And the question you might ask yourself is, how did they create certainty during times of change? So there's a poll question that's come up. It says, what do you think is the most effective way for a leader to create certainty during a time of change? You'll see that on your right-hand panel. All you need to do is pick one of four. So is it a strong sense of purpose, communication, training, or being a role model for change? Think about these leaders pictured here maybe, or think about leaders that you know who have been successful in terms of change. How do you create certainty in times of uncertainty? If you could respond to that poll question now, that would be great. Thank you.
We've got most people who are responding, Anthony. I'll give them a few more minutes and then we'll close the poll and look at the results. So please finish your questions. I'm just about to close the poll. Just a couple more people to do it, so I'll just hang on in there.
That's fine. Can I still talk while that's happening?
You can, Anthony, yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I mean, obviously these individuals pictured here, well, one of them on the bottom left is Napoleon, and he said, leaders are dealers in hope. In other words, leadership is about giving people a sense of direction, a sense of certainty. So now we've got the polls have just come in, yes. And the outright winner appears to be communication. 12 out of 21 people said that communication was the most important. Second most important was a strong sense of purpose. And then there was 2 who said being a role model for the change. So we think about these leaders. The characteristics are that they have all had a strong and clear and unswerving sense of purpose. So that is important. One characteristic that probably stands out perhaps the most is their ability to communicate that sense of purpose. And for you as leaders during times of change, if there is one thing that you have to focus on, it is communication and communication and communication. Not to say that the other things aren't important, they are all important. However, if you can only do one thing, the best thing to do at least is to communicate. And By that I mean open and honest communication. I mean communication that is about dialogue rather than telling people, and opening up discussion. So in conclusion, actions to increase certainty. You do need passionate, visible, confident leadership at all levels. They need to have that through their actions as well as their words, so in terms of them being role models for the change that's going to happen. It's very easy for leaders to completely undermine change by not following the change themselves and by being lukewarm about it themselves. But communication needs to be well-planned, continuous, open and honest, and that is a vital part of certainty. So when you are communicating, remember, one of the key things you're doing is helping people to find certainty. So let's move on to purpose. We've already touched on it slightly. So, if we take an example of purpose, people say to me, well, surely, nobody would embark on a change unless they had some kind of purpose for it. And the truth is that they usually do, though the purpose isn't always that clear to others. And because change can sometimes take a long time, the purpose can get lost. So one example might be the executives going on a sort of away day, away 2 days to create a strategy for change. They've looked at the marketplace, they've seen the competition, they've looked at innovations, and out of that they create a strategy. They get very excited about that, and they go and then tell their senior managers, this is what we need you to do in order to achieve our goals. But somehow when they get to the senior managers somehow don't seem quite as enthusiastic as the executives. And then this may pass down to various people until finally it ends up in employees. And in the case of the Royal Mail, what that looked like was some new equipment. You'll see on the right there a little diagram of a trolley. And it said, and they were suddenly told, well, you now need to use this trolley. You may have been carrying a bag on your back for 30 years, but now you need to use a trolley. And various other equipment, and various other changes. And the big question they had was why? It's very difficult for people to make a change if they don't understand why. So a clear sense of purpose needs to be engaged through the whole organization, not just through the executives. And it needs to be clear and compelling. One of the great challenges is how you communicate a purpose for change. Well, part of the answer is to engage people more in thinking about the marketplace, thinking about the outside environment and why the change is happening in the same way that the executives did. An additional piece is to be really clear and crisp. So if you take the example of this call center, they wanted to go through a change because when a call came in, they kept having to refer calls from one department to the other department and so on, and people being passed to all sorts of different people, great deal of frustration, a lot of complaints and so forth. So their big idea was to create a new system whereby all the information would come to these operators and they'd be able to deal with all kinds of different questions. So they could have described this whole change as, some newfangled telephone system with new whizzy computer system sitting behind it, with all kinds of databases and so forth, which tends to be how a lot of organizations describe their change projects. But instead what they did was they coined the phrase one and done. One and done. And that just meant that one call comes in, one person handles it, and it's done. And the thing about that is it's quite liberating because everyone understands it's not saying we're going to get 10% better at not passing calls across. It says it's got to be done once and it's over. It's a huge challenge, but at the same time it's inspiring and it helps people break through barriers and realize that actually they've got to think more radically about the change rather than just piecemeal trying to improve. So, in terms of purpose, the actions required really are to help people understand what we would call the big picture of change. Why are we changing? What's the context? What's happening in the world that means we have to change? And then creating a clear and compelling purpose for change. So let's move on to control. This is our need for control over things that affect us, particularly things at work. So we look at this photograph. Some of you may have been micromanaged. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but it's basically a manager who tells you everything you need to do, and every time you do something, they tend to correct it. So if you've ever been micromanaged, maybe think about how that feels. People normally say they feel disrespected, they feel fairly hopeless. In the end, they kind of give up or they leave the organization. If they stay in the organization, they tend to leave their brains at home because they know it's not worth doing anything because they're only going to get told to do it again in a different way. So there's all kinds of anxiety and frustration when we lose this feeling of control. And in fact, it correlates very closely to stress and coronary heart disease in the research. But let's have a look at control in terms of change. Some of you may or may not have seen Jamie Oliver's school dinners. Essentially, in a nutshell, he wanted to transform the food that children ate at school. In the UK, kids have a lunch at school which is provided by the school mostly. And Jamie Oliver, who was a TV chef, decided that kids were being fed fried turkey Twizzlers and chips and all kinds of fatty processed food, and it was very unhealthy for them. So he set about trying to change this. And he went to the first school and he trained up Nora, the head cook, who you can see in the photograph, and showed her that she could cook meals from raw ingredients on a budget. She was very skeptical to begin with. And a lot of the children were converted. Jamie is very passionate, so he has a clear sense of purpose and he's a good communicator. But nevertheless, some kids absolutely refused to eat this food. So what he did was he took some of those kids and he got them into a kitchen and he showed them how to cook healthy food. And one thing he did was he held up various vegetables and he said to them, asked them what the name of the vegetable was, and they couldn't name vegetables. And so actually what was happening was they were being asked to eat things that they couldn't even name. So it was rather like somebody outside of you taking control. Basically, people felt like the change was being imposed on them. These alien things were being imposed on them. But when the kids actually learned how to cook healthy food, they suddenly became fans. That's because they'd been given control over the whole process. They felt in command of the situation. Months later, what happened was the government got hold of this and tried to spread it throughout the country, rather willy-nilly, and this photograph appeared in the Daily Mail. And what it shows is mothers outside the school gate at early morning break taking orders for food, for fish and chips and burgers and chips, and then pushing them through the railings at lunchtime so the kids could continue to eat their fried, fatty food. And people may look at these mothers and say, well, they are irresponsible. But the reality is that when they rolled this out nationally, they didn't involve this critical group of people. Kids were coming home and saying that they hadn't eaten. And of course, it's a mother's responsibility as a minimum to ensure that their kids have a healthy meal. And they said, well, why are you not eating? Well, we're not eating because they're trying to make us eat all this strange food that we've never had before. So actually, this is what happens when you exclude a key group from a change without giving them any sense of ownership or control for the change. As we say in organizations, this kind of a group is called a key stakeholder, or in this case, burger holders. So, this is just an example of what happens when you leave a key group out of the process and have them feel like helpless victims of the change. Now for a quick poll. So we're talking about control here. Think about your own organizations when change is being introduced. What is the management style that's most used? Is it a telling style where people are just told this is the change and this is how it's going to happen? Is it more of a discussion style where they say, well, we need to make this change, let's talk about it, what issues might you have? Is it an involving style where people are actually asked to take part, get involved in making the change happen? Or is it an empowering style where very much the change is handed over to the individuals to actually make happen for themselves? Could you answer that poll question now? And we'll take a look at where people are.
Okay, Anthony, we've got about a few people still finishing that poll, but most people seem to be responding. Thank you very much for that. I'll just leave it a couple of minutes to make sure everybody's able to do it, and then we'll close it and get the results for you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, so you should be able to see the results very soon.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. So we've got a wide spread here. We actually have 8 people, the biggest number, actually talking about the tell mode, which is very common. It's something that I see in all kinds of organizations. You've got some, just 2 in the discuss, 5 in the involve, and 4 in the empower, which is impressive, actually. And it tends to be the sign of a maturing sort of organization in terms of their attitude to change, or perhaps the culture of the organization as a whole, if they tend to empower their people during times of change. So that is very interesting. But as you can see from the results, there's quite a number that are still in the sort of tell and discuss phase. There is a lot of people up at this end, if you look at this red dot on the screen. And the challenge is to try and move that dot from left to right. So if you're in the tell mode, then to try and get it into the discuss and involve. And, because the further you move to the right, the more in control people feel, the less they oppose the change, and the greater the chance of your success. So these are just some photographs from a particular program where we are helping people to get to grips with the change for themselves, understand why it's happening, what needs to happen, and also to suggest how the change should happen and get involved. This is probably not total empowerment, particularly as we are talking to 150,000 employees, but we certainly engage them at a very detailed level and getting them involved in the change. Okay. So control comes from involvement and ultimately empowerment. Training is also something that helps people feel in control because they feel they have the skills and knowledge to be successful after the change. Let's move on to the 4th of the 5 forces of change, and that's called connection. And it's our need to stay connected to people, habits, ideas, and things. And this is emotional attachment. So we become emotionally attached to all kinds of things at work and outside of work. So we might be attached to people on our team, the way we do things, our profession, our project, even our mobile phone, all kinds of gadgets that you can't tear away from people. We might be attached to customers and to our workspace. And when change comes along, some of these connections are broken. You can imagine in a Royal Mail, when you've been doing something in the same way for 30 years, the way we do things around here has become ingrained. And there's a real sense of loss when that connection is broken. So this is a kind of a psychological level. But the good news is that there are some very simple things that you can do to help people let go of these connections. One of which is the lose, keep, gain grid. And this just gets people thinking about what are we losing, but also what are we keeping? What has remained unchanged? Often 80% or more remains unchanged. And also focusing people on the positive. And then you want to get people to raise their concerns and feelings about the losses, as well as getting them thinking positively about what's going to remain the same and what they're going to gain. Get them to think about their losses and think about ways of mitigating that, and be very positive in terms of letting go. I just want to, well, there's a quick question, it's not a poll question, but you might want to think, well, what are the biggest changes we experience outside of work? Well, and how do we then mark them? Well, biggest changes outside of work is sort of hatches, matches, and dispatches. Weddings, marriages, moving house, even death. So these are the big changes. And we tend to mark them with all kinds of ceremonies. So I'd like to move rapidly onto a video. Janet, if you take over, I'll just introduce the video. And what this is Jamie Oliver. He's now in America, and he's working with a school over there where, again, they're eating hugely unhealthily. And he meets a family called the Edwards family. And the Edwards have, well, for breakfast they have donuts, but not just donuts. They have deep fried donuts. In fact, everything they eat goes into their deep fat fryer. And they are living a hugely unhealthy lifestyle based on their deep fat fryer. So this is something that Jamie did in terms of connection. And if you just like to watch and hopefully listen to this video. Okay, Janet, if you... So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you enjoyed the video. What you saw there was them breaking an emotional or breaking a connection. It was a symbolic way of moving forward. So when you're dealing with connections, what you need to do is bring the issues of loss out into the open. The worst thing that can happen is that people have a sense of loss, a sense of grievance, and there's no opportunity to discuss it and bring it out in the open. And that's where the lose, keep, gain grid works so well. And then you can come up with your own forms of ceremony which allow people to, if you like, celebrate the past, mark its passing, and move on. I'd like to now move attention to the final of the 5 forces of change, which is success, our need for a sense of achievement. I don't know if any of you ever play sports, things like tennis or golf or etc. And if you've ever been for coaching, what tends to happen when you go for coaching is they take one look at the grip on your golf club or your tennis racket and they say, oh, well, if you're going to ever improve, you're going to need to change all of that. So what happens is you play with a new grip and you play far worse. You go out, you play with your mates or whatever, and now you're playing far worse than you ever did before. So what do? You just revert back to the old ways. And all the money that you spent on coaching goes to waste. And that's what organizations do. They spend all kinds of money trying to improve things. And then when things go wrong and success is diminished, they just revert back to old ways. So you come back 6 months after the lean program, which was meant to improve performance, and you find, oh, well, it hasn't really taken. So the question is, what can you do to create this curve B, where there may be a drop in performance as you go through the change, but people persevere through, if you like, the difficult period and come out the other end performing far better. So I'll take you through a very kind of quick example of this. This is a large retailer. They identified that there was a problem, or that there might be a problem, when they got their sales assistants, not only to sort of find the right size and color for people, but they wanted their sales assistants to engage with customers and talk about, for example, a top that would go with a particular skirt that maybe the customer was looking at. Now, this meant that they were going to have to talk to their customers in a totally different way. So they needed to define what success looked like. They needed, obviously, to communicate and train people in what they needed to do. But what they really understood was that it's all very well communicating, it's all very well training, but it's when people get back to work that the real work begins. So what they wanted to do was they buddied people up so that they could support and encourage people. So people observed and coached and supported each other. So did managers. And the one rule was it was okay to fail. You can have a go and feel that maybe you failed, maybe you feel a bit embarrassed, maybe it didn't feel, how it normally does. But if you work through it, you come out the other side. So it's okay to have a go and fail, but it's absolutely unacceptable not to try. And then there was a great deal of recognizing and celebrating success, so that reinforced the idea that things, and the understanding that things were improving. So it's really about coaching, support, and training to get people through that learning curve to make it a lot less likely that they revert back to the old easy ways and the money invested in performance improvement goes to waste. So that is a real canter through the 5 forces of change. And overall, when people are affected by change, if you can address people's need for certainty, people's need for a sense of purpose, people's need for feeling in control, people's need to break old connections and create new ones, and people's need to feel successful, then if we go right back to the beginning, they are willing and able to choose positively, and you will minimize the disruption and maximize the return that you get from your change program. And just to finish, if you're interested in the 5 forces of change, you can take a look at the books, which are on Amazon. It's the 5 forces of change and 5 tales of change, which is my books. The second book is short fictional tales that bring across these 5 points. And the 5 forces of change is the longer original book, which goes into more detail. But different people like different approaches. There's also, if you go to the 5 forces of change website, access to workshops on how to lead change, and also for staff members in how to embrace change, take control of change for themselves so that they don't feel like victims. And I'm also, as you are aware, involved in working directly with organizations. So if you have any questions, I would like to thank you for joining us on this webinar. And thank you for your attention and your involvement in the polling. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was very informative, as usual. I do have a question myself, which I'm sure might resonate with some of our delegates, is more and more often managers are asked to make changes and do ask their people below them to do more work with less resource. and that's a change that we see more and more, and I wondered how we can encourage people to work smarter.
Gosh, yes. Well, I mean, that's a whole kind of subject in itself. But yes, there is a lot. Obviously, going through difficult economic times, there is a tendency to ask for more from less. I must admit, trying to do that if you're going through a major transformation is kind of shooting yourself in the foot. And I've seen organizations do that and then have to reverse out of it, realizing that actually you do have to focus more energy and resource at something when there's a big change. In terms of obviously working smarter, I mean, there's all kinds of ways of doing that. I guess part of it is organizations need to be clearer on their kind of expectations of individuals and where the priorities lie. And also just this whole sifting between what's urgent and what's really important. There tends to be, in a lot of organizations, tendency towards firefighting and doing the urgent things rather than the long-term really important things. And that sometimes is a cultural piece that needs to change from the top down. I don't know if there are any questions that have been sent in. Mostly they look like technical questions around.
Yes, there's a lot of technical questions. Yes.
Anyone would like to write in a question at all, please feel free to. You'll see on the last slide there's a web address there. You can contact me via info@fiveforcesofchange.com. You'll see that if you go onto the website. That's my telephone number in the UK. If you do have questions, you can go onto the website, or you really just email them directly to me at info@fiveforcesofchange.com. I don't see any particular questions coming through. So like I said, if you'd like to...
We just had one come through from Amanda, Anthony. What would be your suggestions with dealing with hardened cynics who resist change? And yes, actually, I've come across this myself. That's a really good question, Amanda. Thank you for that.
Yes, there's a tendency among certain particularly sort of senior people to say, well, we've got these cynics, and the best thing we can do is get rid of them out of the organization. I wouldn't say, I tend to be against that. If people, rather than being cynics, are actually proper saboteurs, and they're actually desperately trying to ruin everything, then there may be a call for that. But in terms of cynics, certainly I've come across a lot of those, particularly with my current work. And actually by communicating with them, getting them involved in dialogue and discussion, often the cynics are the most vociferous. And the way we tend to engage people is through what we call dialogue, where people work in groups, discussing issues that led to the change, discussing issues around the change. And often the hardened cynics are the ones who get most involved because they tend to be quite talkative. And it's very interesting over a period of time as you're doing a proper engagement piece with good dialogue, that those people you start to see those light bulbs going on. And it is possible, if you do focus on these sort of 5 areas, you can convert them. And I've watched people, even in a period of sort of an hour and a half where they're going through a proper engagement piece, turn from sort of cynics to saying, well, how do I get involved in this change? Who is the core team that's going to make this thing happen? So my mantra is to convert, because if you can convert a hardened cynic, then everyone around them will be so amazed they'll come on board as well. That's my own personal philosophy, and that's what we're doing right now at the Royal Mail.
I should imagine that's quite a difficult task as well, because you've probably got quite a lot of people who are quite, not institutionalised, but used to the way they're working. We've got a question from Leslie. What can first-line managers do in majority change in big organisations for their direct reports when they have little or no influence, i.e. the post office change?
Okay. So yes, that is often an issue. The managers are kind of the meat and the sandwich, if you like. They're getting, the people at the senior level telling them, you must change, and the people at the bottom very worried about it, and they think, when they say to themselves, well, I can't do anything, this is being forced from above, and the people below me are all unhappy, and I'm stuck here in the middle. My suggestion to in that case is essentially to obviously be honest about the change. You know, these are the changes that are going to happen. If you can become more informed yourself about why they're happening, you know, you have a one thing that you can do is to work upwards to the people that are managing you and find out more yourself about why the change is happening and sharing the rationale. And also you can say to people, look, this change is going to happen, but let's all work together to work out the best way of making it work for us as a team in this place where we are working. So, you know, it's a given. There's not much we can do about it, but you can make people feel more empowered and more in control by saying, all right, let's work together. Let's take some control for ourselves in terms of how we make it happen in this particular place.
And Auntie, can I just ask, do you believe in sort of incentives, sort of, i.e. sort of maybe a line manager bringing in some cakes one day to cheer everybody up, or is that just bribery?
I believe in that. That's just good leadership. That's just creating good relationships. And it's about trust. And one of the big things around change is trust. And in organizations, I see somebody's written a question which says, what's the biggest risk or constraint to change? I guess if you are in an organization already where there is a low level of trust, in other words, there's been a history of failed changes, a history of mismanagement or other things, perhaps even unrest with the unions and so forth, you're already starting 2 steps behind. So that is a big kind of barrier to doing all of this. It doesn't stop you by any means. You just got to acknowledge the fact that people are going to be skeptical. But when you show them a new way of leading, a new, more inclusive way of getting people involved in change, helping them understand the whys and wherefores, helping them to let go of the past and see why they need to be helped, why they need to move to a different place, and help them through that learning curve, then you start to shift the ground. I mean, the work at Royal Mail, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, but it is gradually happening as a process.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anthony. Now, do we have any more questions? Mikhail, I could see you're in the middle of typing something. You said you had a couple of questions. Do you have anything else for Anthony? I can't see anything coming through, so...
Make an observation. You may make an observation if you'd like.
Yes.
Okay, so something's come through. It says, change implementation is probably the most important phase of any change. So Anthony just seems to mention briefly in one of his slides. Well, what the 5 forces are not sort of quite time... Well, there's a couple of responses I would make to that. One is, there's obviously, you know, change will fail hideously, A, if it's completely the wrong change to do, and there's nothing here where I'm addressing strategy, a whole different subject. And B, if you haven't got decent project management, then, you know, that would also cause failure. But most organizations tend to be quite strong on project management, but quite weak on the people side of change. And in terms of implementation, really, the 5 forces of change will run through the whole life cycle of the change. So communication and creating certainty, you want to start that before the change. It's vital that you continue it through the change because it's a continuous process. And it's during that time of implementation when people feel the most uncertain. So this is not about sort of, if you do have a look at my book, what you'll see is how you apply each of these 5 forces in the pre-implementation phase, during the transition phase, but also really importantly, and what people forget a lot, is that you need to be doing this stuff after the change has already so-called happened. I say so-called because people think that once, you know, the new process is in place or the new system is in place, the change is over and we can all focus somewhere else. The reality is that people are a long way behind mentally in getting engaged and coming on board, and some people will be months after the so-called changes happen when suddenly the light bulb goes on and they say, yes, I can now move to this new way of doing things. That's another kind of common mistake in organizations, particularly if you say communication. Right, we're going to stop communicating because the changes happen. But actually, you communicate all kinds of things about the positive results of the change, the new heroes of change.
Okay, thanks for that, Anthony. And we've got another question. What's the biggest risk or constraint to change Anthony will normally face?
Yeah, I sort of mentioned trust. I think that's a big one in terms of if you're in an organization where already there's a kind of a negative history about changing, you need to clear the air on that. One of the things we tend to do quite a lot is something called a timeline, which basically allows people to look back at past changes, see how they responded to them, quite often negatively, and then how they view them now in the future. So I think history, and baggage that people come around have tends to be a big constraint. Though each organization and each change tends to be different. It's sometimes surprising when you go into an organization. I didn't expect when I went into the Royal Mail that a sense of purpose was going to be the big thing. I thought it'd be something more nuts and bolts. But the big thing from the people on the ground was the question why. So the first thing we addressed was purpose.
Okay, thank you. We've also got a question. Sometimes project managers change partway through an initiative and bring a different style and approach. Have you any tips to help maintain continuity?
That is a tough one. I mean, it depends who went before and who came after. But I mean, to maintain continuity, it's a good question. I mean, I guess it's a very practical kind of question that happens on projects. I guess.
I must admit, I've actually experienced this myself. So
is language. If you have an organization that understands, if you like, the language of change, and everyone kind of gets to grips, dare I say it, with these different forces, then what tends to happen is, once people have that common language, everyone tends to be working in the same way to make the change happen. You want ways that, so when one person hands over to another, they're going to use the same language around the key things that they need to address. So a good thing is when both the leaders but also staff have that next level of understanding of why change is difficult. It does make it a lot easier. You create what you might call an agile organization, one in which no matter who's kind of in charge of the change, everyone understands the emotional issues that they're going to face and how to best face them. That's about the best I can think of right off the top of my head on that one.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Anthony. I think you'd all like to join me in saying thank you for that very interesting talk. I would just like to remind everyone that we have another webinar in this series, the Career Resilience on October the 2nd, so please join us for that webinar. I'm also finalising the programme for the rest of the year and next year for these monthly webinars, and the November webinar should be quite interesting as well. It's about positive psychology at work and how to be happy at work, which sort of ties in with this one a little bit on change. So just let's say goodbye to everyone and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you very much.